All right. So let's talk about some specifically looking at oxygen. There is a chart that is in your packet. Talks about the characteristics, density, concentrations, and applications for various gases. I'm going to only focus on oxygen. The other ones are there that you should be aware of that you may end up using at some point during your career. But again, we're primarily looking at oxygen. First of all, oxygen is non-flammable. It's a question a lot of people believe that oxygen is flammable. It's not. It supports combustion. That's the key part. There are gases that are flammable. None of the gases that we will work with are flammable.
It will not or will support?
It will support combustion. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. Forget about oxygen. 3 terms that we should cover. First one is non-flammable. Non-flammable will not support combustion and will not burn. So something like carbon dioxide. It's one of the reasons we use it in the fire extinguisher. Second term is supports combustion. That's what oxygen is. It supports the process. Without oxygen, you will not have a fire. Do you remember talking about that last fall? The third ones are flammable, and the word inflammable means flammable. Huh?
Yeah.
Izzy, you don't. English is not your native language, right?
Well, yeah, kind of is.
It kind of is?
Yeah.
Okay. Because that don't make any sense to me, and I'm a native speaker of English. But flammable means inflammable, and okay, whatever. But that means that it burns readily and it's potentially explosive. Again, we will not encounter any gases that are flammable in nature. So the ones that are non-flammable and support combustion are anything that has oxygen as a component of it. So things like oxygen, things like air, which contains nitrogen and oxygen, heliox, helium and oxygen combined, carbogen, combination of carbon dioxide and oxygen is a mixture. And there are reasons why we would end up using that gas. Nitric oxide and nitrous oxide. Nitric oxide we'll find is a very potent selective pulmonary vasodilator. More on that with Lori when she talks about neonatal. That's primarily where we end up using it. And nitrous oxide, you remember, or you may know as laughing gas. What we use for anesthetic agent, because you don't care what goes on when you get nitrous oxide. Okay. The gases that are non-flammable and do not support combustion are carbon dioxide, helium, and nitrogen, the primary ones that we'll encounter. And which medical gases are flammable, or again, inflammable, whatever? None of them. Okay. There are things like some gases used for welding that would be in that case, but none of the ones we will encounter. We can also classify gases as therapeutic or diagnostic. In other words, they serve a purpose to treat or manage a disease of some kind, like oxygen. And the diagnostic, once again, we know that there's a nitrogen washout. We know there's a helium dilution. We know that there's a diffusing capacity for carbon monoxide that we end up using in the pulmonary function lab. All gases are regulated by various agencies. The 3 that you need to just be aware of, first of all, Department of Transportation regulates the transport of oxygen. So any gas that is being transported, again, has to meet some stipulations by the DOT. The Compressed Gas Association dictates the specifications as far as how many pounds per square inch of gas can fit into a given cylinder. And then the National Fire Protection Agency regulates the storage of oxygen or other gases. So for instance, when we were in E building, there was a separate room where we stored oxygen cylinders. Don't have that here. That's why we can't have
actual gas. Okay. So there's regulations that have to be as far as the size of the room, the number of cylinders you can store in a room, and even in the hospital this is true as far as how many E-cylinders you can store in various areas of the hospital. 4 ways to produce oxygen. How do we purify this from 20.95% in the atmosphere down to 100% of the gas? The first one is the most important one, and the one that we will encounter, or the primary way by which oxygen is created, and that's called fractional distillation. We'll talk about that in a sec. A second method that we use in home oxygen concentrators, which basically extract oxygen from the air and purify it. It's a physical separation method. Third way is chemical decomposition. And the fourth way is through electrolysis, which basically uses an anode and a cathode to separate the the hydrogen from the oxygen that's in water. But let's talk about fractional distillation. It was invented by Carl von Linde, 1907. You can still see trucks carrying liquid oxygen with Linde on the side of them. So it's primary manufacturer to this day. And basically it's the process of separating components of a liquid mixture according to their boiling points via the application of heat. So what we're doing is we're basically warming some liquid and allowing at a certain point oxygen's going to burn off. At a certain point helium's going to burn off. At a certain point something's going to burn off. So as we keep raising the temperature, different gases are allowed to escape. So that physical method of separating the gases from air is that we're just basically allowing each of the individual components to be released. So we take air in, we filter it to remove any stuff that we don't want. We dry it, we cool and apply pressure to convert it to liquids. We're getting below that thing that we talked about last time, that critical point. Okay, there's a certain temperature and a certain pressure where it'll stay in a liquid state. We place it in a distilling tower, just like we're making moonshine. And then we allow it to warm to each gas's boiling point. Nitrogen boils off first, then the trace gases, and then oxygen boils off. It then is stored. We then, once it's boiled off, we go ahead and convert it back to a liquid, and that is how it stays. Let's take a look at them. I need that back. And the FDA requires, again, it's another regulating agency we didn't talk about, but we're considering oxygen a drug, so they're going to be regulated by the FDA, and it should be at least 99% pure. Usually it's even more than that. The physical separation method is what's, again, used in a home. And we're not going to demo this because I don't have one with me, but there's a method by which we can go ahead and, just by the simple act of passing air through a bed of pellets, that will actually allow the nitrogen to be absorbed and the oxygen to be separated out from it. In the home care, there's this thing called the Erie flow meter that allows us to verify the flow. I'm going to skip through some of these slides because we don't have the physical equipment, because wasn't important enough to bring, but this is what a home oxygen concentrator would look like. And you can see that we have a couple of features here. A humidifier to allow for moisture to be added to that dry gas. Our oxygen delivery device there. And internally all you have is basically a flow of air that is being drawn through, and the nitrogen is absorbed and all that's left is the oxygen. So it creates oxygen from room air. I need a backup. And there's just another example of a concentrator that you end up having. There are some specific ones, and you can end up actually having, this is the one I wanted to show you. You can actually have it so that the concentrator fills the cylinder, which is kind of nice. So then they can take the cylinder if they need to go to the mall and they have some oxygen with them, come back home and they can place it on this concentrator that not only they can hook up a nasal cannula to, but they can also refill that that system. And I'm again skipping through these. You won't need to worry about them because we're not going to utilize them. Just a couple of features as far as oxygen concentrators. When the home care company establishes it, they want to make sure that somebody notifies the fire department that there is life support equipment inside that home. And they also want to let the power company know that if power goes out, that this person needs this life supporting device. And there's, you know, some other hazards that are there as far as having inadequate power supply. In other words, the amperage will keep tripping a circuit because of the needs of the device. Things like ungrounded equipment, which you don't see that often. And then oxygen that's near flammable material, and a need for backup. It's an electrically powered device, so again, there should be some sort of a backup power supply, like a generator, or at the very least backup cylinders, and there is some maintenance. I'm not going to worry about your responsibilities as a home care RT because we'll cover that if you get into that area of work. Again, patients need to be instructed that they shouldn't smoke. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
I need a backup. That they shouldn't smoke while they're wearing oxygen. To me, that's just common sense, but hello, McFly. But you can see there's a significant number of instances where fires occur while they're oxygen. This is a great little video.
And I apologize for everything. And they'll never catch me smoking another cigarette. It'll be a cold day in hell.
Gloria Pettipas says she learned her lesson the hard way. Pettipas says she smoked near her oxygen tank before. She even admits she knows cigarettes and oxygen are a dangerous mix, clearly evident by signs like this one posted in the building. Pettipas just didn't realize or even think that she would ever start a fire, but she did.
I was in the bathroom, that's all I know, and I heard a tsh noise. I went out and looked, and the flames were going down the hose heading towards our concentrators. And I've run and pulled the hose off the concentrator so it wouldn't hit it, right? And next thing I knew, I went back, and the bed was on fire.
While fire crews were able to contain the fire to the one apartment, they had a tougher time evacuating almost 60 of the residents. Emergency crews loaded the residents onto buses and sent them to Larrabee Village for shelter. Just as quick as a smoke spread, so did word on how the fire started.
My fault, and I advise anybody that has tanks, do not smoke, because it does catch up with you sooner or later.
In Westbrook, Danielle Strauss, News 8 WMTW.
Hello, McFly. Don't smoke or you may croak. Okay. The most common type of concentrator is something called a molecular sieve. And it uses, as I mentioned, these pellets made of sodium aluminum silicate. Don't need to know that. Also known as zeolite. But basically the pellets absorb nitrogen. They also absorb carbon dioxide, but there's a minimal amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as you remember. And they also absorb water vapor. So what's left is basically oxygen. It can provide somewhere between 90 and 95% at a very low flow. So this is not designed for somebody who needs a high amount of oxygen flow, rather just enough to be able to supplement them. And at that percentage, you can get an appreciable increase in the PaO2 that the patient's utilizing. So an example of a question, 66-year-old patient diagnosed with COPD is homebound. Which of the following methods of oxygen delivery be most appropriate? Homebound meaning that they're not going to leave the house. They're pretty much going from the bathroom to the bed to the couch, the bathroom to the bed to the couch. So in that case, certainly we don't need something that's transportable, so we can get by with either a gas cylinder or more preferably a molecular sieve style concentrator. There are also portable oxygen concentrators that came on the market about 5 years ago. So it took us a little bit of time, but this is basically the same exact concept as far as that molecular sieve, but now it's portable. Now I can go to the mall. Here's an example of one, about 7 pounds, so it's light enough that I can carry it, or they come with little carts that you can drag behind you. It's both AC and DC power, so it has a battery built in, and then we can plug it into the wall to recharge the battery. 4-hour usage, and it takes a little bit of time to reuse also. And this is one that we'll talk more about when we talk about oxygen devices, but it has what is called pulse dose delivery, meaning it only turns the flow of gas to the nasal cannula when the patient's taking a breath in. When they're not breathing in, it shuts itself off. In other words, it's a conserving mechanism, so it's not wasting. You can see the nice little carrying case they have. And you can go fly a kite. Oh, this is another one, another brand called the Evergo. It's a little bit longer battery life. The FAA, by the way, has cleared them for travel, so they can take them on an airplane, which is huge. Because in the days prior, they weren't allowed. You had to jump through all kind of hoops to bring a cylinder onto an airline, and in many cases they would not let you bring on your oxygen. You had to use theirs, which of course the cost was exorbitant. So huge advantage having them now cleared for travel. So what about outside the hospital? We use these compressed gases. Well, a couple things. First of all, cylinders are designated by their size, and they're designated with a certain letter. The ones that we end up using, the ones that you'll end up having a chance to play with, are an H cylinder, which are the large ones, and an E cylinder, which are the smaller ones. So the two most common types that you'll end up encountering. Are there other sizes? Yeah. You probably won't see them inside the hospital, but there are other size cylinders to go there. All oxygen cylinders are pressurized to the same pressure, 2200 psi. Regardless of size, they have the same pressure within them. And the pressure is going to dictate how much volume of gas there is inside. We know the two factors that we're going to be utilizing. An E cylinder has 0.28 and an H cylinder has 3.14 as the factor. And that basically is just determining how many liters of gas you end up having. Cylinders are also color-coded. Although you should never definitively go on the color, you should look at the label. Green is the universal color for oxygen in the United States. Canada and elsewhere, it's white. I'm not sure why there's a difference, but okay, whatever. And then you can see the other colors that are associated. They're gray for carbon dioxide, blue for nitrous oxide, brown for helium, black for nitrogen, yellow for air. And that color will stick with not only the color of the cylinder. We'll see that a lot of the delivery devices themselves will end up having that color coding also. Again, we don't want to just go by the color because somebody could make a mistake and put any kind of gas into any kind of cylinder. We want to look at the label. If there's no label, obviously we're not going to use it, just like you would never use a can of food without a label on it. I don't think so. There are various markings on the cylinder, and the markings give all kind of information, such as who the manufacturer is, who owns the cylinder, basically, the serial number, and then there's various test dates to verify, because these cylinders periodically have to go back and be tested to make sure that they're still strong enough to hold 2200 psi. Obviously, you don't want to have a cylinder being used that's got a potential for a leak. Cylinders are transported and stored. You always want to have them either attached to a cart of some kind. You can see there's a different cart for the 8-cylinder and the E-cylinder. And when they're standing free, you always want to have them on a stand. You never want to have a cylinder that's standing without some sort of support. And we'll show why in a bit. And there is a ruling, again, from the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Agency, that says that how many cylinders you can store in a specific area. And again, never allow them to stand. If you need to, lie them down. But more often we have them either in a wheeled cart or a stationary stand. When there's a bank of cylinders, often we'll have them chained to the wall. So you don't want to have them the ability to fall over. And the reason being is you got 2200 psi of gas on the inside. If that is allowed to escape, because something damage happens, you have a huge projectile. It's pretty nasty. How about a Mythbuster? Mythbuster?
High-pressure gas cylinders have been around for 100 years, and legends of their destructive potential have been around for 99. But could a ruptured tank really burrow through a brick wall? Into the next county.
Here we go, shearing the regulator off a tank. Attempt number 2. In 5, 4, cross your fingers, 3, 2, 1. Yeah! That's the sound! That is a lovely, lovely sound.
The valve has sheared clean off, and that's a very good sign. It looks like the cylinder flew straight and true, but did it have enough thrust to crack the wall?
Oh, God. It was the lard that did it.
At 40 miles per hour, the air tank turned the cinder block to cinders. It even put a fair dent in the wall 6 feet behind it.
It totally.
No way.
I mean, it didn't go all the way through, but it went through this one, and it was going. It's working its way through that one.
I was ready to see this as not possible. I was totally expecting it not to actually work, because it's one of those apocryphal tales, and everyone we talked to had heard the story, but no one knew anybody that it happened to.
You know, this was an optimum situation for this tank. What this tank did is as good as it gets.
My favorite thing is just the perfect roundness of the top of this hole. It also pushed this entire wall back a half an inch.
Although the cylinder was deliberately aimed, you couldn't ask for a more convincing result. So let's call this myth totally and spectacularly confirmed.
What color was the cylinder?
Yellow.
So what is it?
Air.
Air. Pretty awesome though. And again, healthy respect. So again, the sleeping giant, as they call it here, treat with respect, like a sleeping giant. You don't want to disturb it. Same is true for an E-cylinder. Just because it's smaller, it still has 2,200 psi within it. It can still be considered a projectile. So storage of cylinders are regulated again by the NFPA. They want to store them in a cool, well-ventilated, fire-resistant area. We store flammable, non-flammable, or combustible supporting gases separately. So we never store oxygen with something that is flammable. We store full and empty cylinders separately, so they're segregated. And we store large cylinders with protective caps that actually are screwed on. You never want to store them so that they're in a hot environment because, again, what happens when a cylinder becomes heated, that gas is going to expand, and you're going to end up having a potential for that cylinder to rupture. Okay? I think that's Gay-Lussac's law, temperature and pressure. Call me silly. And some obvious things, don't store them where they become in contact with corrosive materials or where they become part of electrical circuit. It's metal. It's going to transmit electrical current. And you don't want to have where there's freestanding water to collect. Never try to repair something. What the hell is this guy doing? Okay. Never lubricate or use pipe dope on valves or fittings. Never handle cylinders or any parts with oil. Oil and oxygen do not get along. Oil and oxygen are bad together. They can start a fire. And let's see what some bonehead did here.
One contributing factor is particle impact. Now this one involves small particles that are generated during assembly. Now, over time, these particles can flake off from inside the cylinder. Now what happens is that these small particles can be caught up in the flowing oxygen and accelerated to a high velocity. When the particles hit the internal surfaces of the valve or the regulator, heat is generated. Now, although these small particles wouldn't burn in air under high pressure, they can burn in oxygen, and that can ignite a fire. Another contributing factor is adiabatic compression, also called the heat of compression. Now, this happens when you open the post valve and pressurize the regulator. Oxygen rushes into the high-pressure side of the regulator. As the gas rapidly compresses in this closed compartment, heat is generated, which can also ignite any non-metallic part of the regulator. That heat can also ignite contaminants inside the regulator, which brings me to my next point, contamination. Now this involves exposing parts of a regulator or a cylinder to a contaminant like grease or an oil-based lubricant, parts that come into contact with the high-pressure oxygen. Now those contaminants are very easy to ignite either by particle impact or adiabatic compression.
Makes me want to go ahead and use them. It's not actually as bad as the impression that you get watching it. But again, the key part is not allowing oil or any petroleum-based substance to come in contact with oxygen because it can cause a fire to happen. Always move cylinders in an approved cart. Don't roll or swing or bang together. And we talked about the label not being there. If you ever there when the guy from the oxygen company comes and delivers them, I don't know how they do what they do, because he'll take two cylinders and he'll kick them and roll them. It's like, I'm going like this, it's crazy. So never attempt to repair cylinders. Obviously, if there's damage for some reason, why the hell would you want to repair them?
The following slides were taken as a part of an investigation involving an explosion of an E-cylinder of oxygen. The explosion occurred in the maintenance area of a home care company. As the story goes, the cylinder valve was defective and would not open. The maintenance worker attempted to loosen the valve to a point that would allow the oxygen to leak out of the cylinder gradually. Okay, so the first set of slides here is the wrench the gentleman was using to take the valve off the cylinder. This just shows the valve fitting on the cylinder. This is a chain vise he was using to hold the cylinder on the workbench. And when the cylinder exploded, just ripped the chain right off the vise. And the cylinder bounced around. Here it hit the workbench. You can see the workbench is pretty much damaged here, and this item on the workbench just happens to be the gentleman's watch that was ripped completely off his arm, and his arm was severed completely between the elbow and the wrist. This is where his severed arm landed, and this is a picture of where the cylinder valve and cylinder landed. A close-up of the cylinder valve shows the markings of where the adjustable wrench was on the valve. You can see, if you look a little closer, you can see that the force of the explosion was so hot that it melted the cylinder valve on the inside of the tank. This is a piece of shrapnel from the top of the cylinder. This is another piece of shrapnel from the top of the cylinder. You can see it's pretty much flattened. Remember, this is an E-cylinder, showing how sharp the edges are. This again is the cylinder itself, looking down inside the cylinder. And where did the top of the cylinder go? Well, it embedded itself in the pegboard on the wall across the room. The explosion was so hot that it melted the inside of the top of the cylinder, and it also melted the threads where the cylinder valve attached.
Is that a what? Yeah, it could have been. So the bottom line is, don't do stupid things. What was he thinking? Obviously he wasn't. So treat him with respect. We won't have, we can pull the H cylinder out and allow you to go ahead and remove it from the cart and put it back on the cart and transport it. So do that on our break time. Never leave cylinders in confined areas such as trunks. Transport cylinders with adequate ventilation, and they must be secured during transport. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put it into a child seat and seat belt it in, and we're good. No, I don't think so. Do not transfer gases from one cylinder to another, and never tamper or modify cylinders or cylinder components, and don't pull out your crescent wrench and go ahead and try to pull off the... Good God Almighty. These are just so common sense. So you could fill liquid portables from a liquid reservoir, or we had that cylinder that was attached to a concentrator, but you don't want to fill one cylinder to another cylinder. Let's talk a little bit about the liquid systems. This is an example of one called the Helios. And you can see he has here his small portable, and then he has a larger reservoir that we end up having to transfill it. This is just another of the gas cylinders attached to a concentrator. Just some of the examples of what we were talking about. This is the portion that he was trying to remove. Why, I'm not sure. But you can see it's got a threaded part that goes into the E-cylinder itself, and there is a small post valve there. On the top is where we would turn it on and off. And an H cylinder is constructed a little bit differently. Again, it's got a threaded fitting. This portion here is the part where we would attach a regulator to, and a knob on top to turn it on and off. Internally, what you end up having is as you turn that, it basically opens the cylinder so gas is allowed to escape out the outlet, and the same is true with the small cylinder valve like an E cylinder. And I think I'm going to stop there. Let me just see. Yep, I'm going to stop there. Makes you wonder sometimes. Okay, let's do this.